It's easier, someone once said, to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism.
But it's clear that where we can make systems of this complexity, cultural systems, economic systems, machines of this complexity, surely we could make a world that could first meet those needs I described that everyone should have, and then perhaps meet needs that people have only dreamed of, like the need for some autonomy and freedom. The need for that little space up there, the I part, to expand a little bit. Just a little. Just a little. Just a little.
The socialism that could engage with the yearnings and dreamings
in Miles Davis music.
An aesthetic dimension.
Radically incompatible with everyday life under capitalism.
Hey, hi, welcome to another edition of the Acid Left podcast. I'm here today, Mike Watson, with our guest, Valentina Tanni. Valentina is based in Rome and teaches at NABA, the new Academy of Fine Arts in Rome, and also at the Politecnico University in Milan as Professor of Digital Arts. She wrote a book which came out last year called Memestetica, published by Nero Editions in Italian, and it's just a brilliant book on memes and on contemporary art and the crossover between the contemporary art world and artworks and artists and meme cultures. And that book is coming out soon in Slovenian, and maybe also in English. They're actually talking to, I think, a number of publishers about that. So I do hope it comes out in English. So, this is a conversation which I actually recorded on February the 15th. It was a brilliant chat. It covers a lot of ground in relation to our culture, our meme culture, shall we say, being a culture which is kind of, practically run in a sense by memes of some description, and really the intersection between that and a much more traditional kind of form of symbolism or cultural reproduction that is the officialized art world. So I'll leave you with this. Remember that the Acid Left is on YouTube. We're also on Audible and Google Podcasts and a number of other channels, as well as having a Patreon, which you can look into. You can subscribe for as little as $1.50 a month for a whole lot of content there. Okay, thank you. So Valentina, basically at the start of your book, you talk about the spread of the internet in the early 90s and its role in what you call amateurizing culture. So you refer to the citizen artist as a kind of parallel to the citizen journalist, and to a kind of opening up of creativity, but also this kind of oversaturation of culture as everyone becomes a cultural producer. So it's kind of like the dream envisaged by people like Joseph Boyce that anyone can be an artist, but it actually kind of happened, and the dream didn't turn out quite how we anticipated. For you associate this with Eternal September, and that actually links to your book, as I said in the introduction, Memestetica, the Eternal September of art. So the Eternal September was basically a moment in which internet sign-ups for dial-up connections in the USA became something that anyone could do. So I don't remember the exact details, but it's something like September each year, you would suddenly get like a massive influx of new dial-up internet users in the early 1990s or mid 1990s, whenever the World Wide Web was becoming a thing. And this Eternal September is kind of a description of, this rollout. So you didn't have just, this period of September every year when new students were signing up to the internet in large numbers, but you had suddenly just like everyone worldwide using the internet. So this was like, the kind of explosion of internet use. This is Eternal September. So, you suddenly have a load of fresh, naive internet users at once, and it changed internet culture and made it less of a niche thing and more of a thing anyone could be involved in. So I'm thinking we have a kind of second Eternal September. We have a second moment of internet growth due to COVID. So we already had like everyone using the internet, but there are people who are more involved. There's a kind of specific meme culture which has its own language and which is quite niche, in which you get these kind of cliquey groups who exclude other people because they have this kind of codified mimetic language. But this has kind of been exploded. So now suddenly everyone is online. So just, after that, a simple question: what effect is this having on online culture, but also what effect is this having on the art world?
The expression Eternal September, as you correctly pointed out, was first coined in the 90s. And it can be read as a metaphor for the general concept of access to technology, and through that, a potential access to production and distribution of content, but also, and maybe more importantly, access to communities of fellow creators. This is a very important point in my book, because it's not only important to get to be able to produce content, but the most important thing is to be able to participate in communities of creators, to also see day by day what other people are doing all over the world, which is something very new in our culture. I mean, we always had amateur culture in the past. People also outside the official art worlds or music worlds and so on were doing stuff. But this stuff, most of the time, was not so visible. So that has changed in a fundamental way. But the word eternal in that expression is there to remind us that this is an ongoing process, because it started in the 90s, but it's still ongoing. The number of people accessing the internet and so taking part in conversations and in cultural production keeps growing. And this is happening despite the digital divide, of course. But it is also true what you say about the fact that COVID basically forced a lot of people to get deeper inside internet culture, because social distancing left us basically with no alternatives. At this point in history, if you need to communicate something, if you need to talk to people or distribute content, the web is the only place you can safely turn to. In general, I think that this is having a double effect, because I see a lot of people that are learning about the enormous potentialities of online communication. I mean, finally, and also letting go of some long-time prejudices about the web. I see a lot of people that finally are stopping moralizing the internet and judging people that actually enjoy being online. But I also see a lot of people suffering, because this full immersion is not by any means a choice. It has been for a lot of people an imposition. I'm still not sure about the consequences this situation can trigger in the art field specifically. I'm still in observation mode. But on a positive note, I can see that being forced to find new ways, try new formats to express ideas and feelings and contents is giving birth to some interesting experiments. And I also saw a new interest in net art, for example. I see that web projects, artist web projects and net artists gain some new attentions, and that it's very interesting to note. But I also see a lot of artists that are struggling a lot because of lack of social connections, lack of institutional and financial support. And so the situation is still very difficult to decode in my opinion. Maybe we need to gain some distance to understand the possible actual consequences of this situation on art making in general.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that in itself says something quite profound about art and the internet, or the art world and the internet, because we're talking about an explosion of productivity. Many more people being on the internet for longer periods of time, and I would say probably more people being involved in making memes. And actually, COVID was directly responsible for this in Italy, I know, because I lived in Italy for 10 years, as I often say on this podcast. I know a lot of people there. So when COVID began, I was very much, not involved because I wasn't living there, but I was really seeing how people were feeling in lockdown, before anywhere else in Europe was in lockdown, when Italy was the first country in the West to endure this. So seeing people really kind of suffering, but also, fighting back against the loneliness. You saw the balcony musical performances when people used to go out on the balconies and clang pots and sing, and then the whole world kind of saw this go viral.
Yeah.
And this is one kind of way of dealing with this creatively, but also just a lot of memes. It's something that doesn't really happen in my mind in America and Britain and Finland, where I now live. There's kind of memeing on WhatsApp. So people would like send their friends maybe a joke sequence, a kind of comedy stand-up routine or something. And then they would send it to their friends and their friends and their friends. So they would be simple image memes, but they'd be spreading around WhatsApp. So this is possibly a different demographic to those using Instagram. And actually, I'm sometimes, quite old people, surprisingly. I can't think straight off the top of my head of a specific example. There were so many going around. So this seemed to be like an older demographic using memes or memeing in a new and different way. So, in terms of art being made, there's been this massive explosion, and we could be really kind of happy about that. And surely that is kind of what Joseph Boyce meant when he said everyone can be an artist, and he linked that very much to the creation of a new international, like a communist international, but it was kind of a kind of art-oriented or creativity-oriented international that would empower people. So surely to some degree we're seeing this, and one can imagine the avant-garde artists kind of finding this exciting if they could know about it. And yet we say we don't know what impact this is having on the art world. What's going to happen to the art world? And you're right, we don't really know. And I think it's going to be much clearer when the lockdowns are over and we see the art world restarting, and how it then reacts to the lockdown of the internet, whether it goes more into the internet or whether it goes against the internet, which is, I think, a likelihood. But is that something you think about, this kind of big distinction between the creativity on the internet, which is huge, and you get kids making stuff and getting 1 million views, and they don't then get galleries and become famous and rich. Then you get the people who have a small exhibition in a small gallery in Rome or London, and they really, they kind of act quite special because they have their art show in this gallery, and maybe no one goes to see it or whatever. But there's this big gulf between creativity by the people and then whatever's happening in the art world. How would you describe that, or what do you think about that situation?
There is a basic incompatibility between the art world as we know it and the context of the internet. The internet is a real challenge for the art world because it virtually opens the doors to everyone. It gives people the tools and a potential audience. And most importantly, it gets rid of the gatekeeping figures that are really very important in the art world. The art world is basically all about gatekeeping. You you worked a lot in the art world, so I think that you know that very well. And I think that I see in general a strong defensive reaction from the art world to all of this, to the rise of amateur culture online, because the art world is basically an auto-validating system. and the pillars on which it stands are totally incompatible with the nature of the internet itself. The artwork needs authorship, it needs scarcity, it needs a strong protection of copyright. It is also based on the worshipping of the author, of the artist, and it also needs a sort of strong faith in the validating system of curators, galleries, museums. So if you take any of these factors out of the equation, everything basically falls apart. So I think that the art world it's going to be, and that's what I try also to explain in different parts of the book, is going to become more and more elitist. Because if it maintains its current form, it will just get obsolete. And this is already happening. And it will happen even more in the future. Because of course, in this precise moment, the artist is forced to come to terms with the internet because, as I said before, there is no alternative, right? So they have to use the internet, but they are not happy about it. And they are not basically understanding that the mass participation to the creation of cultural content, it's an historical event from which we cannot come back. We cannot switch off. It's something that had happened, and we can't just ignore it and continue to work in the same way and live the art world and conceive the figure of the artist in the same way we did 50 years ago or 1 century ago. So I think that, of course, there are some exceptions to this situation. I mean, I know a few people working in the field that are actually aware of this historical process and are consequently trying to change things, to experiment new things. But on a more general level, I see a strong defensive reaction to all of this. So yeah, I don't think that the art world as we know it's going to have a bright future.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I agree on the whole. I do wonder, though, whether this kind of demonstrates that the art world, as you said, it's about gatekeeping. So the art world is kind of inherently resistant to a democratization of culture. It doesn't really want that. It says it wants that, and there's a lot written about an art for everyone. But I suppose Joseph Boyce is a really good example, because for anyone who doesn't know, the listeners, Joseph Boyce was a German artist who, as I said before, he kind of made this statement that we can all be artists, or we are all artists. And it was basically a political statement. And it was kind of an extension of an earlier artist you're probably familiar with, everyone, Marcel Duchamp, who basically said anything can be art. So he famously took a bottle rack and then a urinal from a kind of urinal you have in a men's bathroom, and said they were art, or presented them as art. So basically he did that. But for Duchamp, it's very much the case that an artist has to declare objects to be art. So any object can be art, but it has to be an artist, a trained artist saying this, or somebody who you consider to be an artist, declaring these things to be art. Whereas Joseph Boyce said, well, actually anyone could be an artist. So you put these two things together, and you get a situation where at any given moment, anyone can declare anything to be art. And these are real art world figures. But, there's something about this, that Joseph Boyce, he kept making these artworks, that go in museums, very hard to understand to people who aren't trained in the arts, installations using normal objects in kind of different configurations that to many people just look like, a random bunch of objects. So there is this elitist element, but on top of that, Boyce, it almost seemed like he had to be the one saying we're all artists. It really became like a motif for him. It was one of his subjects which he owned. So he would give these lectures, and he would write with chalk on blackboards, and he would then preserve these lectures. These lectures would all be about, how we can all be artists, etc., how we can use art to to spread freedom and kind of democracy, so to speak. But then the fact that he would then preserve these boards, he also talked about shamanism and things. I mean, he had many themes, but the fact that he would preserve these boards and sell them or put them in museums, suggests that he really had no intention of making an art for everyone. And this is very much a contradiction of the art world, that they talk about wanting everyone to be involved. It's become government policy in many countries that, to make a museum show, to get government money, you need to make it for everyone. But as can be seen in Britain, you have the situation in Britain under Tony Blair, they basically made all museum entry free. You actually got a situation in which you've got many more people or much higher visitor numbers in museums, but it's turned out that many of these people are the same middle class people going back to the museums more than once because it's now free to get in. Yeah. So, I don't think that the art world is very good at appealing to everybody. So in a way, I think, what you're saying is right, that the art world maybe is very defensive and very, kind of aggressive towards this art for everybody growing up on the internet, but not really because they think they should be providing art for everyone.
Yeah.
So this is something. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Yeah. No. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I also discussed this particular aspect in the book, the fact that the art world seems to want to, as you were saying, open the doors to everyone. So every museum has public programs. They also make sure to include in their programs relational artworks, performance that are supposed to involve people, social practice project, and so on. And beginning approximately from the mid-90s, this all resurgence of relational art, which is, of course, something that takes a big inspiration from the avant-garde from the 60s and the 70s, also Boyce that you were talking about. But in the mid-90s, there was this big return of the theme of participation. And so this idea of making people part of the artwork or finding ways to involve the local community, it's something that the art world show. It's something that has to be there, but they are not really they want people to participate, but following some precise rules. I mean, the public has rules. You can take part, you can participate, but the artist is in charge, the museum is in charge, and the people can take part, they can participate, but only inside a framework that is set in advance. While on the internet, participation is totally unregulated. It's wild, and it's not possible to just regulate and to also to anticipate. It's a totally wild environment. So as you can see, it's a different kind of, it's a different way of thinking about people's participation. About also the ready-made idea and how art has changed during the past 50 years. In the book, I also try to discuss the status of the audience right now. And I think that the ready-made and in general, the birth of avant-garde languages and practices, even if it was supposed to open art to everyone, actually had the opposite effect in most cases, as you were also saying, because separating art from specific techniques, like paintings, sculpture, also disjuncting art from technical abilities in general, from skills, actually resulted in making most people think that modern art is a fraud. So even when people online seem to actually adopt and enjoy, because I also discuss this in the book, sometimes we see some performances and some content online that makes us think about Dadaism, it makes us think about performance, about situationism, about conceptualism in general. But this content, these people, most of the times make this content unknowingly, without any awareness of the historical precedents or the possible artistic meaning of those kind of actions. They enjoy those tactics, but by no means they consider it art. Because most people, this is always surprising to me, but I think that we are still there, because most people still rely on the romantic and somehow religious idea of art as a sort of calling, a vocation. And also technical skills are still valued over anything else in the general public, because technical skills are the only measurable thing in art. And people get really uncomfortable if a precise method of assessing quality is totally absent. And this is the case in contemporary visual art most of the time. And so there is this difficulty in the general public to understand some contemporary art languages precisely because of that reason. But at the same time, and this is another point that I make in the book, a lot of people are unknowingly making performance art. They are enjoying art making. They are enjoying doing weird and entertaining things together online. They are making actual collaborative art projects, even if they probably don't associate that particular behavior with the tradition of high art.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting. I mean, again, kind of, it says something about what art is, or what kind of art world art is. But it actually says something that could be seen as positive in this case, because you say that technique is like the one thing you can really judge still. You can really kind of, like, in a sense, quantify how much technique someone has or how much skill someone has. But we can also quantify how many views or likes someone has. And that's kind of quite sad in a way, because you're getting a situation in which some very kind of silly statement, some very kind of trash statement can get really a lot of attention. And once it's got 1,000 views, that may be reason enough why it would get 2,000, because people think, hey, people are looking at it, so maybe I should look at it as well. So you get like cats playing piano, or cats just not even playing piano, but doing stupid stuff, just being cats. And the videos of these cats get 20 million views, but the average professor can only get a couple of hundred views. So everything we learned about, study, do well, follow the academic system, or other kind of skill-based systems, learn artistic techniques or musical techniques, they've gone out of the window because people just get famous for doing silly stuff, and sometimes accidentally. But the art world kind of counters that you still need, well, not always actually, but often, one needs skill, or at least skill can be valued in the art world. So that is kind of a good thing. But it kind of goes back to how bourgeois culture anyway, to some degree, defended the arts in the modernist period, in the last century, where capitalist production tended towards trash objects, whereas the bourgeois class would pay to go and see some classical composition or art performance, or pay for an artwork. I suppose that's still being the case. It's bourgeois people, middle class people, who pay for paintings. So they're kind of keeping alive technique outside the capitalist system, even though we all know we all somehow kind of fit into the capitalist system. So there is that kind of point, but it's just a shame that remains. So that's kind of a positive point. But then to go negative again on the art world, that remains within a certain social class. Definitely, it's a middle class paying for middle class people to use certain techniques or certain media. So we have that problem again. So I don't think there's any way around this until we really open up technique to everybody. And I mean, that's a big job, because that needs really a realignment of the complete social structure, because anyone can be online, but does everyone have the time to learn techniques? So to make good quality videos online, for example. I mean, it really depends on education for one. It really says a lot about actually the societal structure in general, even going beyond art, because we can easily kind of point at the art world. It's almost too easy. I do it all the time. And it's easy to say these bourgeois people running the art world and keeping it to themselves. But the real issue is, somebody, I don't know where, but if we could say Brooklyn, but I don't even know, it's probably been so gentrified now it doesn't make any sense. But in Rome we could say Pineto, it's still the same thing, it's been gentrified. But imagine a working class area. The next great opera singer isn't going to come from this working class area, for example. How long is it going to be before we can say that might be the case? It's going to be a long time, and the only way we really solve this, so that really anyone can be an artist in the real sense, it's just through more education and giving people the opportunity.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on this. But I was speaking about skill, because in general, contemporary art in the last century or so underwent a process of de-skilling, meaning that it kind of abandoned the traditional techniques. So it doesn't mean that skill is totally out of the picture, but traditional skill in the meaning of being actually able of technically producing something in a traditional sense, right? But that kind of give birth to another kind of skill in the contemporary art world. But if we think about learning techniques in a more general sense, I mean, not only referring to the art world, the internet is also giving the opportunity to a lot of people, much more people than before, of accessing learning online. So also, we see a lot of spontaneous creativity, that it's just doing stuff without caring too much about quality, about maybe the quality of the image, or maybe about the quality of the craft in general. But we also see a lot of incredibly skilled people that basically formed themselves all through e-learning. That's another new thing, because we didn't have that in the past. Access also to technique has widened a lot. There are still some boundaries, of course, because as you were saying, you access is not enough. You also need to have the time to dedicate to this kind of activity, and that is related to your social extraction, your social situation, your economic status, and so on. So time is still something, it's still a resource, it's still a scarcity, maybe it's still a luxury for some people. But access to e-learning is also widening the number of people that are actually able to also to reach very high levels of technical skills.
Yes, yeah, I mean, that is for sure, yeah. But I think here we're seeing so many kind of contrary trends. So you could say there's more skill, but then there's this higher degree of amateurization. And then there's also like a de-skilling in the art world, which has made other things more important than skill. So maybe this kind of very gray area of taste, which Karen Greenberg, the critic, spoke about a lot. But just kind of, how does one judge something to be good? But there is like, possibly this kind of tendency or skill to be able to kind of see whether something looks good, aesthetically works, and maybe that's how one can judge things. And people have this skill or don't, but the actual technique becomes of minimal importance because the rearranging of colors on a JPEG or in a Photoshop document doesn't take much skill, but you still need to have that kind of taste. But then this kind of goes out the window as well when you get to shit posting. I think you talk about the deliberate tendency to produce low-grade images or to make deliberately aggressive or taboo statements. So this in itself gets complex. I think we're really being challenged on so many fronts here to really understand what makes something good in a cultural sense. But I think that's just a huge issue in itself. There was a brilliant book called Kant After Duchamp by Thierry Dedeuve that goes into what taste might mean in the age of conceptual art. But he basically just said it's like there's a kind of conceptual beauty that's somehow equal to an aesthetic beauty. And it's a similar thing that it's looking at something or it's thinking about something that you can't quite understand why it makes sense, but it does make sense. But anyway, it's something the listeners might want to look at, Kant After Duchamp. But for now, because that's a huge issue, I just want to go to something you say in the chapter called The Dissemination of Photography, where you talk about the amateurization of photography. And then you go into these Google Street View artwork. So there's two artists at least, but there's two ones that are really well known for this, who basically go to Google Maps, go to the Street View, where you can see like literal, kind of 3D street level view, and they find kind of bizarre, tragic, and comic images. John Rathman is one, and Michael Wolff is another one. So this kind of leads you on to talk about the derive, which we've talked about a bit on the Acid Left recently on our podcasts and videos. So basically, Guy Debord, the situationist kind of activist and thinker, he talked about this idea of the derive, so kind of like a wandering around a city with an idea of remapping it, maybe projecting new values onto things. So in a sense, kind of decapitalizing or moving away from the status quo model of how to look by randomly navigating your own local space. So in a way, this is something we can do online. And I think it's a really good point. I'm doing some writing now about Walter Benjamin, exploring a similar idea. Walter Benjamin having kind of been influenced by the flaneur, and you mentioned the flaneur figure, this kind of 19th century French bourgeois figure who used to wander Paris aimlessly as almost a radical kind of undertaking. I guess just there was not much else to do, but it's kind of a posture of there's nothing to do, so I'll wander and get taken in by the modernist city and see where it leads me. And I think there's a lot to say for that today, that maybe this is how we should be treating the internet. We're so much working at capitalism's pace on the internet. We can't think straight. We can't make informed decisions, or this whole thing of the internet being democratic. You will probably remember as me the early kind of ideals of the internet. Anyone can use it, therefore it must lead to worldwide democracy. And it's not really led to that. Anyone can do anything, but we invariably end up kind of going from meme to meme without making any kind of meaningful or without developing any kind of meaningful ideas whilst doing this, which is a real problem for the online left or online politics, I guess, in general. So I'm just thinking, the thing of like using the internet, navigating it like a city in a derive-like way, of slowly, in an almost kind of meditation-like way, working one's way through the internet and not being rushed on by the kind of data capitalist algorithms. You know, this I think can make the internet much more useful. That having said that, I don't really have a question now. I just want to say that. But I mean, how do you envisage this? Because you speak a bit about the flaneur. Were you thinking something similar?
That's that's exactly what you said about yes. I referred to the flaneur in exactly that sense, in this possibility that the internet gives us to just wander around and explore worlds. And this can be interpreted in different ways, because it just can be you mentioned John Ruffman, for example, and in that case, this wandering happens on Google Street View. So you kind of move around, not physically, but with your mind and your eyes through a replica of the real world. So it's just the same act of wandering around with no particular direction, just exploring the world and trying to find the unexpected. But we also can think about this idea of of flaneurism, also just related to web surfing in general, and to web surfing without having in mind a particular target, without searching for something in particular. And a lot of authors have worked on that concept. I can also mention Kenneth Goldsmith, for example. He worked a lot on this idea. There is this wonderful book named Wasting Time on the Internet. And in that book, he says precisely that, the fact that on the web, there is so many possibilities, so many things you can bump into, so many situations, so many different peoples and cultures and way of thinking and possibilities and alternatives, that you can actually be a flaneur and kind of reenact this idea of the reeve, so following the birds concept, in a digital environment. So in the book, I mentioned both these two kinds of contemporary digital flaneurs, and I think that surfing online can facilitate that kind of experience and that kind of mental wandering that can lead to discoveries and new ideas and so on. But of course, in the contemporary internet, this behavior is less and less common, unfortunately, because of the spread of big platforms. You know, people are spending a lot of their online time on Facebook, on Instagram, and all these on social platforms. And this leaves out a lot of the internet itself. It just kind of tunnels you inside a very small and controlled and also governed, a world that it's also ruled by algorithms that most of the time you also don't know exactly how they work and how they were designed. Of course, most of the time they were designed for selling you things, but the system is it's very dark, it's very opaque, it's not easy to understand from a user point of view. So I think that what I always try to remind to my students, for example, that are very young and they didn't have the opportunity to use the internet before a social network happened. So sometimes they actually don't know that they can wander around, that the internet is such a big and diverse place, and that they kind of need to get also out of. I understand the power of social platforms, and I use them a lot, and I also understand why people use them, because they with all their flows, they are very powerful means to connect and to find things and so on. But I also try to teach kids that the internet is a very big and diverse place, and that is the power of this technology.
Yeah, well, that's definitely true. I mean, there is a sense in which anything is possible on the internet, and then that feels kind of scary, because then you see just these kind of quite terrible things happening, or at least the rise of the alt-right, and then QAnon in America. Then you see this kind of situation on January the 6th when the Capitol building was stormed, and it felt like an explosion of just the worst elements of the right wing from the internet just kind of appeared, like in this very important building and symbol of democracy. And that kind of feels like it's coming out of the fact that anyone can say anything. But then if you look on the internet, all you're really seeing is the kind of center ground in politics, and this kind of caricatured far left scene that revolves around kind of Stalinist imagery and Soviet imagery, and this caricature of a very far right politics. So we're not actually seeing everything. We're just seeing a kind of lot of extremist statements, or in my bubble on the internet anyway, it's what I'm seeing. And there's just so much more out there. And there's a lot of stuff out there that just isn't politics at all. But we do tend to get led down these very narrow kind of pathways. So yeah, maybe it's not a problem that anything is possible, where therefore we end up with these kind of really weird, interpretations of the political extremes. Maybe it's just that not everything is really possible, because we're just being led down these kind of over obvious paths. And of course, that documentary on Netflix, I don't think it's perfect by any means. The Social Dilemma, it does say some interesting things, and I think it's right in saying that we are pushed to extremes because the internet kind of favors conflicts, because conflicts get people clicking more and get people making data. So I think we are kind of pushed to these kind of edgy extremes with nothing kind of in the middle. So yeah, I think you're right. And if we slow down, we can maybe see more. There is that tendency to tend to go with whatever you're being presented with. And I think it's like a trick of psychology that people understand who have designed the internet. So you do a Google search, you're probably going to go with what comes up on the first page. You look at your Facebook, you're going to get involved in what comes to you first. I don't even know who I'm following anymore, but it's not necessarily who I asked to follow. Or certainly, many of the people I would be following have been pushed down, so I don't tend to maybe see what they're posting. And I think when you've got information coming at you, you're not really thinking, well, hold on, maybe I'm going to delve a bit deeper, because the brain's isn't designed that way. You get just very preoccupied with what you're seeing immediately in front of you. So we need to kind of deprogram this. And I think this kind of flaneur-like activity is a good way. I don't know how it's going to be achieved without basically reprogramming our minds first, I think. But yeah, I'm kind of into this idea of what I call slow memes. It sounds a bit kind of boomerish. I don't know if it would ever become that popular, because it's got the word slow in it. So it kind of suggests, you shouldn't be, it wouldn't, doesn't sound fun for like the accelerationist left or right crowds, or generally young people who just want to get things done as fast as possible. And I can appreciate that, but I don't really mean it in the sense that, one has to slow down and be just very dull and boring. But just like somehow if we slow down our memeing, maybe the production as well as the reception, it might open up more radical paths. Sometimes you do have to slow down to get to a more radical point, because there's nothing really radical in just consuming memes so fast you can't really think straight. And that feeding the data economy is, almost the opposite of any radical goal.
That's interesting. I mean, the concept of slow meme, it's very interesting, but I would like that, but I'm not sure that we can actually think of getting things low at this point. I'm not sure about this. I don't know if it's a pessimist view. I think that it's difficult to imagine the production and the distribution of content slowing down and people taking more relaxed approach to knowledge and to social relations. I don't see that happening. I would love to, but I'm not sure that we can actually do that at this moment. The strange and the difficult thing right now, I think, is the fact that chaos is a defining trait of our historical moment, and contradictions maybe more better, not just chaos in a general way, but just contradictions are everywhere. And we, as single human beings, but also as a society, on the contrary, we have a strong need to organize things, to categorize things, to make distinctions, to have reference points, and in this particular moment instead, complexity and contradictions are basically the norm. And these, sometimes I refer to this in the book also, this can lead, and this is very worrying, but this can lead sometimes to apathy, because we feel like we are not able to make clear distinctions, to take informed and responsible decisions, because we are so overwhelmed with so many different sources of information. But at the same time, we always feel like we are missing something. And so this is very challenging, I mean, for the human society in general. It feels exciting at times, this idea of having so much alternatives, so many possibilities. It's exciting. And I think that this is also the reason why we see so much creativity. We see so much people engage in producing stuff. Okay. But at the same time, this is profoundly scary for the human society, this idea of not being able to fix points, to have a clear distinction between good and bad, to make really informed decision about your life, because you have so many different sources of information that you are not able to take a decision that makes you feel, okay, I have read stuff, now I know how it works, I can take my decision. This is kind of impossible right now. And this generates a lot of terrible consequences that we see right now all over the world, including conspiracy theories and people that kind of negate reality in general and so on, because this is a consequence of this world full of contradiction. It's kaleidoscopic and it's very confusing. But I'm really fascinated by a quote that I found by Marshall McLuhan in a book called "The Medium is the Massage." You for sure you know that. Yeah. The book he made with Quentin Fiore, and in one particular page. McLuhan talks about the shock of recognition, and that for me is a very interesting and probably not enough quoted idea by McLuhan, because he basically said that in an electronic information environment, let me read this. He said, minority groups can no longer be contained and ignored, because too many people know too much about each other. Our environment compels commitment and participation. We have become irrevocably involved with and responsible for each other. So I think that this is really, really insightful, even also now, 40 years later, because it says a very important thing. The fact that we see each other all the time, and too many people, he said, know too much about each other, and so we are kind of involved with too much people, with too many things, and we feel responsible for too many things at once. And as you can understand, this is both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. This idea that the world kind of sees, people all over the world kind of sees each other all the time. I mean, for beautiful things, interesting things, terrible things, weird stuff, and so on. No? It's incredibly beautiful, the diversity, but I think also terrifying.
Yeah, it's weird. Yeah, it's kind of carnivalesque, or it's kind of fits into this kind of archetypal idea of a very vibrant situation, but which is somehow a bit hideous. There's something a bit scary there. There's the unexpected. I mean, it's just like this. I keep going back in my mind to this Capitol building insurrection on January the 6th, just because the images that came out were so weird.
Yeah,
it's something that I think a lot of people find disturbing. Yeah, it's
like the reality. It's out weirding fiction by far.
That's true. Yeah. But also, unfortunately, it's the right wing who seem to be out weirding the left as well. True. I don't know why that is.
True.
But I suppose if the left were being that weird, then there would be immediate kind of retribution from the status quo, from people in power who are, centrist to right wing. I mean, if Bernie Sanders' movement was doing anything quite so weird as the QAnon movement, then I think there would be immediate kind of retribution or a punishment from the center towards this kind of left to center movement, possibly. But anyhow, maybe it points to a kind of lack of imagination on the left, but I think it points also to a definite sadism in the right. This kind of weird imagery and the weird concepts of the QAnon movement are a little bit aggressive. That it's not just weird; there's an aggression in the weirdness. The left don't really tend to deliberately do aggressive stuff. I mean, that's kind of obviously we have problems like the gulags in Soviet Russia. If we're going to talk about the whole left and the history of the left, but the left broadly doesn't start out saying let's do something really disturbing and horrible. So we're a little bit in difficulty, in terms of the scope of our imagination. We don't have as many options as the right, perhaps.
Yeah, that it's an old problem that we keep discussing, and we don't seem to find a I mean, I speak for myself. I haven't found a satisfying answer to this dilemma of the left not being able to, light the imagination of people, or kind of not be boring, or not be so ordinary in a boring way. Of course, it deals in. I mean, it has something to do, as you said, with the fact that we have. I mean, that we tend to have. I mean. Better principles. We don't want to be aggressive to people. We don't want to instigate violence, because that level of we define that weirdness, but it's much more than that. It's a form of communication that fascinates us, because it's visually really incredibly appealing, but the contents are really violent and really dangerous. So we are kind of attracted by the aesthetics, right, of some of that contents or some of that actions, but we know that form carries controversial and dangerous content. So I don't know. It's I keep hearing and reading people that try to solve this dilemma. I mean, what the left, including yourself, what the left can do, right, to be in a way appealing to people, not being that violent, not being that dangerous. I mean, how can we be weird and intelligent and appealing, but in a good way? I don't have an answer to that question.
Yeah, that is difficult. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think some of us, have a job of talking about this. I mean, yourself to some extent, although I suppose you're more talking about aesthetics, but there's a definite kind of suggestion underpinning your book of this also being a political thing, this kind of amateurism. I mean, I'm talking about this stuff, and one can end up making a career of talking about this stuff and not really knowing what to do. And there is this kind of thing of being on the borderline of maybe making a breakthrough, which is kind of where left-wing aesthetics is stuck, is where it's positioned, from Benjamin and Adorno on, possibly going back to Kant even. This is the area we function in, and maybe if we keep going over these antinomies, these contradictions, something will eventually break through. With that in mind, I'm just thinking we're not really at a kind of breakthrough point with this whole internet phenomenon. There's this democratization that's led to changes, but it doesn't seem to have led the whole way through. There's still a lot longer to play out because, there was first this kind of idea in the late 90s. I suppose from the very early internet in the early 90s, from kind of dial-up internet and almost cable TV type based variants of the internet or pre-internet. This idea that anyone's going to be able to use this stuff, therefore we're going to have people all over the world connecting and making a democratic world. And then you've got kind of tests of this situation, movements which were emerging, particularly around the economic crisis, also the Arab Spring, that were emerging and organizing in on the internet, and this feeling that maybe the Occupy movement or maybe the Arab Spring movements, can challenge the status quo or the hegemony because they're using the internet. Actually, the Zapatista movement also used the internet, or were kind of early pioneers of political internet or political art on the internet. But then we saw these things being tested and invariably failing, particularly the Arab Spring. If you think about that in a way, what you originally had in Iran and then later on in Egypt, people using Twitter to organize, and then people in the West maybe giving them mirror servers to help them continue using Twitter, and people just generally watching from the West and saying maybe we can get rid of these dictators, some of which we actually have been supporting for a long time, and then things happening like the government's also using Twitter, obviously, as they would, so they could see also what's going on and they could find the dissidents and then put them in prison and torture them, etc. But then also these leaderships giving way to like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which isn't really better than the regime before, government before, then Libya ending up a total mess, and then Syria, that really being the revolution, obviously not revolution, failed uprisings, really being a continuation of the Arab Spring. So the whole thing just went very wrong, because I think the elite, they have kind of responded to that initial challenge, through brutal suppression in some countries. In other countries, it's more of a like using the confusion of the internet, the way top-down messages, narratives have been stopped, so that everyone is like involved in narratives, of using that kind of confusion that results. This is kind of a very Adam Curtis thing to say. He's just released his new documentary, but of using the confusion to make a smokescreen behind which they carry on doing their things. So you get people like Trump, Johnson, etc. Just saying contrary and daft things all the time, to kind of partake in the general mayhem of the internet, and then behind the scenes they're carrying on basically kind of neoliberal policies whilst pushing a kind of nationalist agenda. So this is kind of like the first fight back of the powerful, and then I don't know what happens next. But there's still a whole thing, a whole process to be played out, and there will be obviously further ways of closing down the internet or the freedom of the internet, either coming from governments or coming from Facebook and Twitter, etc. But I think there's going to be new internets and new variants of to counter that. But whatever's going to arise from this kind of democratization of information on a level we've never seen before, I think we have decades to really understand where that's going. I don't know how you feel.
Yeah, I'm with you on everything you said. It's we had a first pioneer phase of the internet where it was full of utopian ideas about it. People really thought that this technology could bring more democracy, more freedom, more participation, and so on. And that kind of happened to some level, but not in the way it was described, and not in the way we really hoped it would. Then there was a second phase, more when we actually realized that the situation was much more complex and much more controversial, and also we witnessed the arrival of all the big companies that kind of monopolized the internet. So again, capitalist economy taking over and bringing all the capitalist problem inside the internet as well, because there was a short period of time where the market was just approaching, but not really there, okay? But then it was, the internet was, of course, colonized by companies and governments and so on. So the whole environment got really much more complicated. Now I think that we are in a third phase where we think, as you were saying, we always have this feeling of being close to a breakthrough, close to a change, close to a big game changer, something like that, but we don't really grasp exactly what this new internet could be in the future. I think that the crucial point here is always, I mean, this may sound banal, but I think that the most important thing at this precise moment is educating younger generation about the use of technology. Not, of course, I'm not talking about teaching them how to use software and how to use digital technologies on a technical level, because they do that by themselves great. I think that we have as a previous generation, we have the responsibility to kind of pass along what we have learned in the past about the internet. So and so teach younger generation how to kind of manage this technology that, as we said many times during this conversation, is a dangerous tool. It can be used in many different ways. It can be a very fascinating and incredible liberating also environment, but it can also be dangerous. It can be it can bring about dangerous ideas, violent ideas. It can radicalize people in horrible ways. And so, but I think that trying to teach kids about to be more critical and more aware of the consequence of the things they do online, it's crucial at this point. So I think that education is the only way to kind of try to influence this development.
I think so. Yeah. I think that there's another kind of point where when we could be met with the response of like, okay, boomer, in the sense that
Yeah.
no one wants to be told, like, you need to be taught, or we can teach you about the old internet. But I mean, I think actually this is kind of an attitude which is calming down. Actually, this kind of okay boomer. I'm just getting less of it now towards me. When there was a situation a year or two ago when there was this kind of edgelord culture in forums, like on Facebook, on Facebook pages, where you would get really a lot of some very sarcastic comments. I suppose it still goes on, that you get these people who try and derail conversation, and if you want to make the point, I think you need to consider history, or I've got something to tell you. You do get this kind of kickback from younger people, because it's seen that the internet's really not the place for that. We have liberated ourselves a bit from the expert. And certainly, if you look back to the theory blogging period of K-punk, object-oriented philosophy, i.e. Mark Fisher, Graham Harman's still blogging, but when this was really big in the kind of first decade of this century, and up to like really around 2012 or so, I think, when you had a few people, Levi Bryant as well, making these philosophy blogs, Nick Cernacek, that was still, it was great, because people could easily connect with Mark Fisher, Graham Harman, people like this through their blogs, but there was still this distance. You were talking to Graham Harman, he was above you, would email him. There was still this certain kind of level of respect, and I think he would get a bit upset if people didn't give him enough respect, which is probably correct. But now that's kind of evaporated as well, and I think I'm kind of happy, because I think there was a thing of like, there was a theory blogging period. Anyone could blog, anyone could interact with the bloggers through the comment sections, or you could normally find them. So like, if you couldn't speak to your own professor, which you couldn't very easily still in the early 2000s, I was studying in the 90s and early 2000s, you could probably speak to somebody else's professor, because you couldn't speak to your own professor at your uni, but you could find Graham Harman or Mark Fisher or somebody. Or Mark Fisher at that point was teaching not university but college level, but still, he was someone you might want to connect with. That was a great kind of breaking down of boundaries, but it wasn't completely broken down. There was still some level of like, these people are above us. So I'm kind of glad that's been removed. But at the same time, I'm not glad when I want to say something and I'm called a boomer, because you're not supposed to talk with any kind of authoritative tone. And while I agree with that, I think, where are we going with this if we just can't? So I do kind of agree, if we just can't talk with the tone of authority, where are we going? We're just being led by the blind. But so I agree with you that there's something we can teach. I don't know. I mean, maybe I can say it about myself, because I've been using the internet at uni when I was already 19 or so when I started uni in the late 90s. So by now I'm a veteran of the internet. I've never really, stopped being obsessed with the potential of the internet. I was more time on the internet on my art degree than I was in my studio. So, I am a kind of veteran, and I think I have something I can say. And so I agree with you that I think it's a case of maybe teaching people, but I think, with the kind of addition that I don't mind being taught by anybody. And I'm sure you also mean this.
Yeah.
We can teach people, but I'm not surprised with somebody who's 18 has something sensible to say, on the internet and about the internet.
Yeah, it must be, we must connect as in a dialogue, of course, because authority is not something that you can impose on people. Authority is something that people gives to you because they are kind of, they learn to kind of trust you, and so they listen to you. But you can just impose authority on people, and kids, kids do their job when they say, okay, boomer. It's their job to also doubt authority. Thank God for that. It's their job to be skeptical of what older people say to them. It's okay. It's how generational how generational change works. So I sometimes feel old in particular situations because I'm a veteran too. But I think that's a normal generational process. This idea of kids just refusing sometimes to be taught, and that's okay. But I think that I try, and I don't know if I am always successful in doing that. But what I try to do is to establish a dialogue in which I teach them stuff, but they also teach me stuff about their generation online, about what they do online, about how they perceive the internet as a social and as an artistic space. And so there is a mutual exchange, because for me, it's very important to listen to what kids are telling me and also watch them act on social platforms and see how they act really differently. Comparing to how my generation used the internet. So I think that sometimes it works when the dialogue is established. And so you try to not be so attached to your old ideas, okay? And just pass along what you think can be useful to them. But at the same time, you listen to them and try to understand their gaze, which is fundamentally different from ours.
Well, that's interesting. I find I find, because I've been teaching, a lot of what you're saying I think relates to you being a professor. I found instances when I've introduced vaporwave, for example, to a class, and you expect this kind of look of recognition from some students of what vaporwave means, and then you just realize that no one in that particular class of maybe 15 to 20 students knows what vaporwave is, or shit posting. So it's interesting, this thing of learning from them, because then you actually learn that a lot of this stuff is very niche. It's not everyone's culture. It's not the culture of everyone who's young. So yeah, I don't know. Some movements appear to be maybe made by millennials, but they have a huge appeal to Generation X, or it could be. This is difficult because millennial can now be around 40 years old, but it could be older millennials getting into what younger millennials are making. There's this big crossover, and I think it's part of underground culture like vaporwave, which kind of started fairly underground, or part of mainstream culture like Netflix. If you look at something like Stranger Things, these productions that are maybe made by millennials but appeal to Generation X, possibly deliberately, because then you get a bigger audience if you're making something for Netflix. Or it's often millennials fascinated with Generation X culture because they kind of feel like they missed out, and there's actually this feeling of like, I missed out on not having the internet. I missed out because I've got the internet. I didn't have just cassette culture. So there's this feeling that maybe we had it better in the early 90s or 80s because we didn't have the internet. So you get this nostalgia, a kind of hauntology, to use this term from Derrida, talked about by Mark Fisher a lot. But this kind of nostalgia for a past that people didn't actually have. But then, in them doing that, like vaporwave using 80s music, they also then appeal to Generation X. So there's much more of a crossover than is often talked about. There is this whole okay doomer culture, which is often, as you say, correct, but there's also this crossover, which actually is brilliant, because then that does give us the opportunity to make a much bigger movement. Because the tragic thing about okay boomer is that you're trying to say something and then you realize that there's a conflict between you and these younger people, and then how are you supposed to bridge that gap? For example, during the election that Corbyn lost to Boris Johnson in 2019, but again, when Bernie Sanders was going for the nomination, sometimes it felt a bit sad that you couldn't make these links. But I think that, you know, actually the links are much bigger than the occasional situations you get of misunderstanding. And you know, thinking about that, I think, you know, this thing of there being now some already decades of the internet to draw from really gives us an opportunity to try and build a movement and to work out, you know, what it is the left is supposed to be doing with this thing. So that's a kind of point I will leave it on. But do you have any last comments?
No. I'm totally with you. And I think that it's interesting, this idea of trying to build strong bridges between different generations. And I also think that when I was talking about generational change and about education, I think that can be something that the left can work on, because for sure the right is not working on education at all. On the contrary, they are often on the other side, so spreading misinformation and just taking advantage of ignorance and so I think that maybe working in a serious way and continuing in a continuous and serious way on education can be something that the left could do better.
For sure, yeah, and that's a great point to finish off. So Valentina Tanni's book is called Memestetica. It will probably be out in English soon. It's currently in Italian from Nero Editions. It's great. I would have said so much more about it, because there's so much there about art and artists and how they interlink with meme culture. But please, if you can, look into it. We'll publicize it if and when there's an English version. The Italians amongst you can read it. Actually, it's quite easy to translate documents of that nature now as well. Although I suppose people would be getting it in either a book form or is it on e-reader? Is there an e-reader form?
Yeah. You can also find it
I don't know how
as an ebook.
Yeah. I don't know how you would go about translating, but anyway, if you can manage to, then please.
Sometimes automatic translated. Sometimes is better than nothing. but anyway, we are working on it. Hopefully there will be an English translation, but I don't know when exactly.
Okay. Well, I look forward to that. I've already read it, as I said. Brilliant book, and thank you for being here. We'll keep following you in the future and hope to speak again soon.
Thank you for having me.